The Federal Reserve had a big chunk of the frozen Iranian assets, $1.3 billion in securities and another $1 billion worth in gold. This was the easiest to get back since it was under government control. The U.S. Treasury also had Iranian assets, $400 million worth on deposits for American military equipment that was paid for by the Shah but never delivered. This sum is the source of the controversial payments made to the Islamic government of Iran by the Obama administration. Financial institutions in this country also had a lot of Iranian money, more than $1 billion worth. Most of it was immediately taken by the banks to offset loans made to the Shah that weren't being paid. Foreign branches of American banks had the largest amount, $4 billion worth, mostly held at the Chase Manhattan London branch. Freezing that money was especially contentious because European banking laws did not allow the government freezing of assets to offset business losses. Finally, U.S. corporations had frozen Iranian money, $500 million worth, which Iran never gained access to. As for outstanding loans or claims against the frozen assets, they totaled nearly $10 billion. That's roughly $50 billion in today's dollars, but no one knew for sure. The Shah's wealth was the second part of the financial deal to get the hostages back. The Islamic government wanted that money too. By some estimates, it ranged in the billions of dollars. With only about a tenth of that physically located in this country, the U.S. had no legal right to touch that money. The financial aspects of the hostage crisis were never publicly discussed. There were at least 275 lawsuits aimed at getting Iranian money.
The United States government at that time was convinced that the Shah had to leave the United States, and I think the Shah himself said to ensure the fact that the hostages were not endangered, he knew that he had to leave.
They told him, "You are not welcome anymore. Your visa has expired."
Frantically, they began to look for another place that he might go. Again, that where came up, and again the delay in treatment.
The Shah thought he would be allowed back in Mexico.
Mexican people told President López Portillo, if we are not good to treat him, we are not good to rescue him.
The risk posed by the Shah's presence in the U.S. was such that President Carter sent his chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, in an exhaustive search for possible countries to admit the Shah.
They began negotiations with Panama, but in the meantime, they decided that he should go to an air base in Texas, where he and the Queen were allowed to establish their quarters.
The transfer from New York to Lackland was arranged under tight security. The confined quarters of the psychiatric wing of the military base finally generated a vocal complaint by the Queen. Ironically, the ill treatment and misdiagnosis of the Shah up to that point or afterwards did not warrant such an outward display from her.
But meanwhile, the spleen became larger, the blood count became worse, and it was evident that his spleen had to come out.
The main concern was to get the Shah out of the U.S. Then they want the Iranians to keep the wars of killing one American every 24 hours.
Arrangements were made to fly him to Panama with his entourage, and he was flown to Contadora Island.
The Shah was let in with the understanding that the reason for his visit was medical and for humanitarian purposes only. After the taking of the American hostages, medical or humanitarian grounds did not warrant his presence in the U.S. With his pride injured, the fallen monarch arrived in Panama City and was flown by helicopter to the Pacific resort island of Contadora, 35 miles southwest of the capital. The king and queen found comfortable respite in the vacation home of former Panamanian ambassador to the United States.
He was given refuge in Panama because the Americans couldn't find any place to send him. And you remember that Carter and Torrijos signed the Canal Treaty. So General Torrijos felt he owed Carter a favor. And that was the favor that was done, was to accept the Shah in Panama.
Diplomats speculate that Washington wants the Shah to remain here in Panama until the hostage question is settled.
We were informed by Dr. Carlos Garcia that the Shah was going to have an operation because Dr. Garcia and Dr. Adan Rios, had been taking care of the Shah, and his blood count was very low, and that he needed to have his spleen out because it was destroying his blood cells.
Dr. Keene came down and initially thought that he would be treated at Gorgas Hospital, which was in the Panama Canal zone and was an American administrated hospital. The Panamanians felt that he could be treated as well as in a Panamanian hospital.
And so the next morning they called the Gorgas Army Hospital director and asked for the Shah to be transferred. Of course, it was denied because the American government did not want the Shah anywhere near any American facility or any American doctor or anything that smelled USA to protect the hostages in Tehran.
We were so shocked by this question of hostages that I even volunteered to leave a New York hospital when I was under treatment to eventually help solve this problem. And this time...
In Panama, they wanted to do the surgery. And the physician in Panama wanted to do that. They asked, let us do it. But Ashraf, his sister, he said, no, I want an American physician to do this.
We had prepared to do the surgery on a Sunday morning, very early. Also, we had negotiated through the American Embassy and the U.S. Army to have a blood separator sent to Panama. At that time, that was a very new type of equipment with Dr. Gene Hester, who was a hematologist in Houston. And they had about 10 U.S. soldiers of his blood type set up there, just fresh blood.
The aim was processing large volumes of normal donor blood to collect and concentrate sufficient granulocytes for replacement therapy on leukemia patients, a technique Dr. Hester had been involved in developing since the early 70s.
So we seemed to have everything going very well, when all of a sudden we got an article from New York where Dr. Keene had stated that the Shah would be admitted that weekend to a Panamanian hospital for a splenectomy. And then on Wednesday, Dr. DeBakey made a statement to the press that he was coming because nobody in Panama knew how to take care of a spleen.
Dr. Keene decided that Dr. DeBakey should be the surgeon rather than the Panamanian surgeon. But Dr. DeBakey was not a spleen surgeon. He was a very noted and deservedly noted cardiovascular surgeon, world famous.
They just went by the name. They just went for the prestige. They just go for the, you know what? My gallbladder was took out by DeBakey.
Typical Ben Keene. I'm going to get the biggest name I can get. That's pure and simple Ben Keene.
I said, for God's sake, why they chose him? He's not the man for this procedure, just like that. But I knew that nobody going to tell him, you know what, Dr. DeBakey, please don't go. This is not your job.
Why you being in that position, you accept to go to a different country, which is not a good idea, to do an operation that you haven't done maybe in 30 years or 40. He was a big man in abdominal surgery in the 40s. And then in the 60s, he became one of the top surgeons in cardiovascular surgery.
Yeah, a good cardiac surgeon can do abdominal surgery, but why not get a guy who does splenectomies all the time?
Dr. Keene says in his book that he had a brainstorm and called Dr. DeBakey because Dr. DeBakey had operated on many world celebrities, and the Shah deserved a celebrity surgeon.
Dr. DeBakey was under the impression that he had been hired by Ben Keene and probably Rockefeller to come to Panama to do the surgery. And he's such a famous man that he thought that You know, all the doors would be open to him right away, and that wasn't the way the U.S. Embassy and our government had planned it, because he's not allowed to practice in Panama. He's not a Panamanian. But our government issued a special ruling saying that he could work as an observer and a consultant to our team.
And with all the fanfare and noise, Dr. DeBakey comes to Panama. I come here to operate on the Shah. How do you feel if you were a Panamanian surgeon?
We had told Dr. Keene that he was welcome to join our team. What happened was he got off the plane with his team.
There was a certain arrogance there. I think they felt they had been upended all this time.
No surgeon with self-respect will allow himself to let somebody from another country come and do the operation for him. If you're in charge, there's only can be one chief, one captain of the ship.
Dr. Keene was furious. I said, Dr. Garcia de Paredes, but Dr. DeBakey goes all over the world operating on people. And I told him, this is not Afghanistan, you know.
Settled on a miniature chair in a foreign land, far removed from the peacock throne, once again, the king's indecisiveness had created a vacuum for others to make important decisions about his affairs.
And it went back and forth between Dr. Flandrin, DeBakey, Keene, the Panamanian surgeons, to where would the operation take place and who would do it, when it would be done. Meanwhile, the spleen was getting worse.
Dr. Keene told the Shah in Panama that he didn't want to have the operation in Panama because he didn't trust the Panamanian surgeons.
And he was afraid that the Iranians would pay General Torrijos for us to kill him during the surgery. And General Torrijos had told us, if the Shah dies, you're all going to jail.
And Ben Keene was there manipulating all the way around.
That in terms of the facilities that I found there, I recommended that the operation not be done there because I felt it would increase the risk.
And Dr. DeBakey never even went to see our operating rooms or any installation in the hospital. He just came and we met in the library, and that's where we had our meeting. That's the only time he was in our hospital. How can he say all these things? He never even walked in to see our recovery rooms or anything.
Meanwhile, the government of Iran had arranged for a lawyer from France to come to Panama City to arrange for the extradition or the arrest of the Shah.
I believe that the Republic of Panama has sort of is trying to contribute to the peaceful solution to the whole crisis.
And one of the General Torrijos, very, very important consultants and assistants, went to Tehran.
Adding to the failing health, the Shah now had an extradition and a possible firing squad in Iran hanging over his neck.
And when I interviewed the Panamanian lawyer Juan Materno Vasquez, who had been a Supreme Court judge, and he told me, you know, we had arranged to have the Shah placed under house arrest, to have the trial, to have the hostages immediately transferred to the Swiss embassy, and once the trial was over, they would be released. On the Saturday, the two lawyers from the Iranian government arrived in Panama. They were going to place in our courts the file for extradition on the Monday, and he left on a Sunday, the day before.
Queen Farah called her friend in Egypt, the wife of Sadat, and she said, "Come to Egypt."
Relieved to be escaping Panama and Torrijos, the Shah declined Sadat's offer of the use of the presidential plane. Instead, for his trip to Egypt, he follows American advice in chartering an Evergreen jet, a former CIA operative airliner. As soon as the Shah's plane left the tarmac, Hamilton Jordan and the Carter administration made one last effort to negotiate the freedom of the hostages via the French lawyer Bourget in extraditing the Shah. Khomeini had made it clear to his people that he did not want the Shah to reach Egypt. As a final sign of appeasement, the Americans forced an unscheduled landing of the Shah's plane in the small Portuguese island of Azores in the Atlantic for alleged refueling. Hamilton Jordan and his counterpart Qutbzadeh continued discussing the Shah's fate. Everything was in place for a new extradition process. But at the last minute, Qutbzadeh informs Jordan that the deal was not approved. The negotiations fell apart. After a 6-hour delay, the sick, feverish king was allowed to proceed, oblivious to the danger that had just passed, and helpless in stopping what was about to come.
Will the Shah be staying in Egypt?
We'll have ample time.
Yes, his permanent stay.
We'll have ample time after the operation to speak with you, gentlemen and ladies.
You will stay here permanently, sir?
Yes.
President Sadat and his wife were there to greet the Shah and his queen. They were very amazed at how wan and thin the Shah looked.
The Shah had nowhere else to go. One way or another, Egypt would be his final stop.
Dr. DeBakey came 3 days later, ready for operation. And the splenectomy was scheduled and done. It took about 80 minutes. Spleen came out easily. And shortly after the operation, the Shah looked quite well.
So in effect what you're saying is that the operation for the removal of the spleen went well, and if he now continues to respond to chemotherapy, he will continue to live at a fairly normal rate.
Exactly, and he's done extremely well following the operation. Really, I think his progress has been much more rapid than we had hoped for.
Dr. DeBakey was awarded an Order of the Egyptian Empire by President Sadat for his operation. But within a couple of weeks, the Shah began to have pain in his chest, developed fevers, chill, and he was not doing well.
Oh, it happened the most famous surgeon in the world hadn't done a splenectomy in 40 years.
Dr. DeBakey had decided to leave his patient without a drain.
You drain it.
Oh, definitely. I would have put a drain in because there was a hole that we're leaving. The spleen was about that big.
Usually when we do a splenectomy, especially in cases like this, we leave a drain to make sure that everything is able to drain out which doesn't belong there, especially since there's a very close relationship to the pancreas.
The pancreas is the thing you have to pay a good deal of attention to when you do a splenectomy. The tail of the pancreas, the end of the pancreas, is usually intimately stuck into what we call the hilum of the spleen.
Any surgical teaching tells you that when you go in there to remove a spleen, you have to take extreme care to avoid damaging the pancreas.
The specimen from the Egypt operation ended up in the New York hospital.
And the pathologist who received the spleen, they found a piece of the pancreas. That's bad surgery.
An avoidable injury to the pancreas caused by the carelessness of his surgeon is added to the Shah's list of complications.
So I fly into Egypt and I see the Shah and I speak to the Egyptian doctors and they tell me that he nicked the pancreas and he was running fever. I said, you must start him on intravenous antibiotics. He said, His Majesty doesn't want intravenous antibiotics. He wants oral antibiotics. I said, I don't care what His Majesty wants. I'm telling you, you've got to give him intravenous antibiotics.
In this most crucial juncture in the Shah's health, the sole medical decision maker and self-professed doctor to the Shah, Ben Keen, suddenly leaves the scene and returns to New York. In his absence, Flandrian observes that no one is inclined to accept the diagnosis of subphrenic abscess, not even Dr. Coleman.
I was worried to death that he had a subphrenic abscess. And DeBakey called and assured me, he went back to see him, he says he does not have a subphrenic abscess. Now he was on steroids. They put him on steroids, which masks, this is not what you do. I mean, it masks an acute abdomen.
When the Shah developed a subphrenic abscess after the splenectomy, that was due to splenic injury that was not recognized.
Conflicting reports are coming out of Cairo, Egypt, on the health of the deposed Shah of Iran. The newspaper Al Aram says his condition is deteriorating, but his doctor says he's better, and official spokesman Robert Omeo seems optimistic.
The fever and the infection is being dealt with antibiotics. That normally is a slow process, but the doctors tell me it's moving along.
Well, now, of course, the spleen is removed, his blood has returned to normal, the bone marrow is normal in its activity, and they can resume the chemotherapy that they've been using.
When Dr. DeBakey said he did not have a subphrenic abscess, he was not operated on, but he got worse and worse. His fevers got higher and higher. Pain got worse and worse.
His ego would not let him to admit.
According to Dr. DeBakey's account, the Shah's bone marrow and blood were back to normal, to the point that he was ready to continue chemotherapy.
Now, the gold standard therapy at that time was CHOP, and we had developed a therapy called COPLAM. And you use many of the same drugs, but the dosing is different. They're all the good standard therapy, but you cannot mix the two. And if I remember correctly, the Egyptians tried to mix the two.
At this stage, a massive infection caused by Dr. DeBakey's splenectomy, his negligence in not leaving a drain, injuring the pancreas, using steroids, which masked the infection, the mixing of chemo drugs, and 2 months' delay in treating the subphrenic abscess are the main reasons for the Shah's deteriorating health, and not his cancer.
And finally, Dr. Flandrian called a specialist in France by the name of Dr. Fagnier, who specialized, strangely enough, in complications of surgery, to come to Egypt and operate on the Shah.
They had to call a French surgeons to go and do a correct problem. It's sad.
And what I heard later from one of the Egyptian doctors was they were really very upset with the French. And they told Sadat about it, and Sadat, being a clever man, came over and saw the Shah. And he said to the Egyptian doctors, "Can't you see this man is dying?" He said, "Let them take the heat for it."
Dr. Fagnier operated on the Shah almost immediately, drained the subphrenic abscess, and then he drained approximately 1.5 liters of pus. But he had really suffered from this infection for a long time. And in July of 1980, he finally lapsed into a coma and died. I think that he suffered for much too long with the subphrenic abscess. Could have been drained a long time before that. But because there were too many doctors involved, too many interpretations, he endured much too much for too long.
The whole thing is a book of malpractice from the point of view of hematology, oncology, surgery, handling the complications.
What happened here is you had too many cooks spoiling the broth. Now, there were huge political ramifications, but you got to have a captain at the helm, and a captain at the helm whose only agenda is to get that patient better.
It's sad that a person with so much power, so much money, couldn't get the care that he needed because of his political needs and the political situation of the American government and the Iranian government and everybody else involved.
Through what seemed to be some small medical decisions, that it changed the consequences of that revolution in U.S. relationships with that part of the world. It wasn't so much, I think, the death of the Shah as it was the way his health issues were handled.
The Shah got into a position of where he was almost never seeing the reality of his sickness, of his relationships, of his positions, of the people who were taking care of him. And it had to result in a personal disaster for him.
Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died on the morning of July 27, 1980, at 9:50 a.m., aged 60 years old. He was buried at the Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo, the same mausoleum where years earlier his predecessor and father Reza Shah was initially buried in exile. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran for the last time. 10 days prior to his departure, the heads of the four great Western powers, the United States, Britain, Germany, and France, met in the small Caribbean island of Guadeloupe to decide the future of the King of Kings and his nation, Iran. After all, this was the year their oil contracts were to expire.
در این موقع آقای ژیسکاردستان وارد میشه، میگه که نه دیگه تمام شد، عمر شاه روزهای شاه شمرده شده و راه مرض سرطان داره و شاه خواهد رفت، باید به فکر یه چیز دیگه بکنیم. آقای ژیسکاردستان اطلاع حاصل کرده بودش از بیماری اعلیحضرت، به طور خیلی محرمانه از همین آقای برنارد میدونید.
Lord David Owen, then British Foreign Secretary, writes that after leaving office, the French Foreign Minister told him that the French were indeed aware of the Shah's diagnosis. President Carter involved himself in an unsteady game of musical allies and facilitated the toppling of the already unstable monarch in favor of political Islam. This was all achieved under the banner of democracy, human rights, and the Iranian people's right to self-determination. But for Carter and the US, there was blowback. The president was also consumed in the inferno more than any of his co-conspirators from Guadeloupe.
Students think that Iran is our enemy because they're building nuclear weapons. And I find that interesting. And a lot of it stems as well from George W. Bush's speech in The Axis of Evil. And so many, for the year after that at least, maybe even longer, every time those three countries were mentioned, the Axis of Evil was put right next to it. So that you get these kids at very impressionable ages who just think they've always been our enemy. They had no idea that we were ever allies. They had no idea that there was something particular, that there was a set of decisions made during a very brief period of time that have led us to where we are now with these decades now of sanctions that have affected our relationships, well, and Iran's relationship with the rest of the world, for that matter.
The Carter administration failed to grasp the real meaning of political Islam. Fast forward 30 years later, President Barack Obama followed the line of his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, in trying to reforge a path of reconciliation between the U.S. and political Islam in Iran. Relations with Iran were the one legacy President Obama pursued vigorously to all ends. But at what price? The price of democracy, the price of human rights, and the price of the Iranian people's right to self-determination? The same idealism and naivety that brought down the Carter presidency can no longer touch President Obama. However, the impact of his decision to negotiate with the Shia Islamic clergy that hold actual power in Iran, or President Trump's willingness to further pursue this path, will be the real legacy left behind for future generations.